Hey, Jim Heskett here, juggling author, and if you're here watching this video, that means that you are also a juggling author. Now, the juggling author brand is mostly related to time management for authors, but there is something that's near and dear to my heart, and that's writing craft. I'm not the best at marketing, I'm not the best at social media, but I am good at time management, and I think I'm pretty good at writing quality fiction. If I could toot my horn a little bit, toot toot. So there is something that I want to talk about today, and that is Elmore Leonard's 10 Rules of Writing. Now, I blogged about this on the Juggling Author site, and I'll probably add this video to that blog. Specifically, I wanted to talk about his 10 Rules of Writing, and it comes from, to give a little credit here, it's excerpted from the New York Times article, Easy on the Adverbs, Exclamation Points, and Especially Hoop-de-Doodle, which is such a brilliant title. That's a great title for an article. Elmore Leonard is one of my favorite writers. I think he's absolutely the best dialogue writer of all time. I don't think there's any question that anyone nails dialogue the way he does. That he is really who taught me how to make my characters sound different in dialogue. Anyway, I'm going to stop blabbing. So here are the 10 rules. 1. Never open a book with weather. Now, I think the key, the main key to understanding these 10 rules of writing is that none of them are essentially meant to be taken literally. And that you have to understand the spirit of the rule rather than the letter of the rule. Because when he's saying never open a book with weather, what he's really saying is get to the good stuff as soon as possible. And he's saying, don't use cliches. A lot of these rules kind of say the same things because there's one later that says, isn't there one later that says, well, anyway, he's saying don't use cliches, basically. Like, so many books have started with weather. Be different, be interesting, get to the good stuff right away. Because if you start off your story with 3 paragraphs about how it was a sunny day in the Shire, nobody's going to care about that. Nobody cares about the weather. They want to see a character. They want to see that character want something. And they want to see that character met immediately with conflict in getting that thing. Like, what is it Kurt Vonnegut said? Your character has to want something right away, even if it's just a glass of water. Which is brilliant. Which is exactly the point. Like, without desire, there's no struggle. Because if there's desire, then you can have conflict. If there's no desire, there's no conflict, and you have a boring story. And maybe that's great for literary fiction. When the point of literary fiction story isn't the conflict, and it isn't even really the character. The point of literary fiction is the way you craft your sentences, and it's the imagery you paint. So you don't even really have to have a story to have a great literary novel. And I'm not pooping on literary fiction. I love Cormac McCarthy. He's one of my favorite writers, and he's definitely very literary. Anyway, so never open a book with weather. Yes, what that is really saying is don't be boring, get to the good stuff right away. 2, avoid prologues. Now, this is essentially saying the same thing that the first rule is saying, because this is the same thing as rule number 10, where rule number 10 is try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip. And that's what's saying avoid prologues. Now, he's not saying you can't have a prologue. And I've seen some commentary on the internet clashing against these 10 rules of writing where people say, some great novels have prologues. And I'm sure that's true. But the point, I use prologues in some of my stories. But what I don't do is I don't include something in a book that has nothing to do with the rest of the book. I'll include a prologue if it directly affects the story, if it affects the plot, or if it directly affects a character that happens later on. I will generally use a prologue if it's something like if it's a POV who doesn't appear later, or if it's just something that happens before the main conflict starts. But I would never include a prologue that just told you something about the character's hometown, or told you something about the character 15 years before that doesn't affect this direct story. Like, I would never include a prologue for color. Because how do you remember, like what I talked about in rule number 1, don't open a book with weather. You want to get to the good stuff right away. You want to get to the character. You want to get to the conflict. You want to get to the desire. You want to get to the struggle right away. And so if you're including 1,000 words or 3,000 words or God forbid 10,000 words of color to start your story, then it's just boring. Now, the caveat here is if you're a famous author like famous author like George R. R. Martin, sure, you can get away with having a 30,000 word prologue that has nothing to do with the rest of the book. It's more acceptable in fantasy for the prologue to be color or world building, because fantasy reader, epic fantasy, I shouldn't say all fantasy because the rules would be different for urban fantasy or PNR generally, but epic fantasy readers are accustomed to having a book, a 300,000 word book that 150,000 words of that don't have anything to do with the plot, that they're just kind of there to set up the world, because that's why they're reading that stuff, for the world. So, but if you're writing thrillers, if you're writing tight contemporary romance, don't have a prologue that has nothing to do with the rest of your story. Number 3, never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. Now, what he's saying here is write simply. That you might think that a friend of mine was taking a writing class in college, and he told me that they read a book by the Hardy Boys, or maybe just a chapter or something, and they were supposed to note every time in this chapter they used a word other than said for dialogue, and it was something like that 99% of the time they didn't use said. And what he's saying here is that if you're an amateur writer, you might think that said is boring, so you want your characters to reply or to exclaim or to respond. And what you're doing there is you're telling instead of showing. What you're doing there is if you say, "Are we going to go to the movies?" she questioned. You're already asking a question by including the little symbol that goes zoop, boop, boop. That's called a question mark. You're already telling your readers that it's a question. So you don't need to say, "She questioned." Or you don't need to say, "Are we going to the movies?" she questioned. "Yeah, we should go to the movies," he replied. The fact that there is dialogue happening in the second part that refers to the question in the first part automatically makes what happens in the second part a reply. So there's no need to use the word replied. You're essentially doing the same thing twice. You're giving the reply, then you're telling the reader it's a reply. So you're insulting the reader's intelligence, basically. It's hand-holding, it's telling, and it's not showing. Also, that the word said is basically been used so many millions of times in fiction that it's invisible. "Should we go to the movies?" she said. "Yeah, I think we should go," he said. You basically don't even really see the she said, he said in that exchange, because the he said and she said is so common that it's invisible. And it really only serves the purpose of telling you which character is speaking. And if you have a scene where two characters are talking, you can often get away with not using he said and she said at all, except every once in a while to make sure you know who's speaking. Like you can have, "Should we go to the movies?" He said, "Yeah, I think we should go." "What movie do you want to see?" "Oh, I'm not sure. What do you want to see?" And at that point, you know, up till now, you can pretty much tell who's speaking, but then maybe the next line of dialogue, you want to use he said or she said to differentiate. Or if you have a scene where there are more than two characters, then it's a good idea generally to use Bobby said, Steve said, Jill said, whatever. But okay, I kind of went on a tangent there. But the point is, don't get crafty with your craft. Be simple. Don't insult the reader's intelligence. The reader can understand and comprehend a lot more than you think. And if your character is replying to a question, you don't need to say, "She replied." It's just pointless. It's overdoing it. All right, number 4. Never use an adverb to modify the verb said, he admonished gravely. Now, if you can't tell by now the way that Elmore Leonard writes these rules, that they're supposed to be funny and they're supposed to be ironic. I mean, he includes he admonished gravely. But what he's saying there, this is exactly what I was talking about in rule number 3. Like I said, where a lot of these overlap, because basically he's saying, don't insult your reader's intelligence. If there's one line, I love the Harry Potter books, but she definitely did, especially in the earlier books, have huge love of adverbs that got on my nerves, particularly in dialogue. Like she would say something like, but don't house elves deserve rights? Hermione asked questioningly. And I'll just roll my eyes when I see that, because if you ask a question, obviously it's questioningly. There isn't really another way to ask a question, maybe suspiciously or angrily. But the point is what he's saying. The reason you don't want to use an adverb to modify said is that if you do your job and you're writing the dialogue well, the reader will understand the intent of the sentence. The reader will understand how they're supposed to take that sentence based on the words you choose and the context compared to the paragraphs before and after it. Because that's how smart readers work. They can read through it. If you're doing your job, then they understand how you meant the sentence. And so including an adverb to modify dialogue is just like rule number 3. It's insulting the reader's intelligence. And after a while, the readers are going to get annoyed with that. Now, in Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling didn't do that. She did not do that in every single sentence. If she did, I might not have made it through the first book. She only did it from time to time, and I liked the story enough that I put up with it. But still, it bothers me that happened. It bothers me that there wasn't an editor who said, you don't need this. Even though you could argue, well, it's a kid's book, and so maybe kids aren't as clever. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm not here to talk about how clever kids are or whether Harry Potter is literary or not.